Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message
On the book of Romans.
with Brady Randall.
Today we're continuing to look at Romans chapter 3 and how God makes his people in right standing before him. And today we're going to look at verse 25. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand go unpunished. So this phrase, sacrifice of atonement, is an interesting one. The word here is propitiation, which means to satisfy the wrath of God that he has against sin so that his standard of holiness is not therefore compromised. The atonement is the amends-making death of Jesus on the cross that satisfies God's wrath and justice against sin. And what this says is it had to come through the shedding of blood, because without the shedding of blood, there is actually no forgiveness of sins. I want you to think back at the very beginning of the Bible. Genesis is the first book of the Bible. In Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve did the one thing God said not to do, which was to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God had told them if they had done that, they would surely die. And they did it. And they ate the fruit, and immediately their eyes were opened. They realized their nakedness. They were ashamed. And do you know what one of the first things God did? He covered the shame of their nakedness with an animal skin, presumably killing and shedding an animal's blood in order to cover them. So in other words, an animal had to die in their place because sin equals death. The wages of what sin equals is death. And throughout the Old Testament, all the bloody sacrifices prefigured the death of Jesus. Imagine in the sacrifices, the smell, the sound of the slaughtering of animals, the sight, the blood dripping, the disgustingness of it all. It pointed to the fact that sin equals death. And onto the scene comes Jesus, who had been called the sacrificial lamb, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And here Paul tells us exactly how this takes place, that Jesus is that sacrificial lamb. He's that propitiation, or the sacrifice of atonement. And when he was on the cross, he shed his blood, and it was the sacrifice of atonement, the amends-making death, whereby God looked at his own son, and he counted that death as having satisfied what God actually required. So here he demonstrated his own righteousness so that he could be completely consistent. He poured out wrath and death upon sin itself, which Jesus bore on the cross, and that is incredible. And this is to be received again by faith. That when you acknowledge that it should have been you, it should have been me hanging on the cross, and you accept this by faith, by putting your faith and trust in Jesus, on his finished work, then you can receive his forgiveness. Another picture that comes to mind in the Old Testament is the Passover lamb. And when the Israelites were about to escape from Egypt, God told his people they had to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, take the blood and basically paint it on the door frames of their house. And when the angel of death came through, he would pass over all those who had the blood on the doorposts. Now, what did the people do to deserve the angel of the Lord passing over them? Nothing. The only thing they did was to obey what God had said, and the blood therefore covered them as the angel of death passed over them. And that's what Jesus has done with his sacrifice of atonement. And notice he did this because in his forbearance, he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. In other words, what humans actually deserve immediately when we sin is that basically we'd be zapped or punished. But God, in his mercy and his forbearance, he overlooked these sins by looking ahead at the cross. So someone in the Old Testament could be forgiven by God looking ahead to the death of his own son, and you and I can now be forgiven by looking back to the cross and what his son has accomplished. That is amazing. Amazing grace. How can it be that Jesus Christ would die for me?
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.